I mean, most of it, like, it's an interesting kind of field research because, of course, what you have to do to get an effective study is to really isolate something down and look at that individual thing. But the problem is that, of course, nothing works in isolation, and so it's not very real world. So you always have this kind of almost there's opposing goals, and this is where I've always said that's great that people want to do that kind of reductionist research, because we need that's helpful. But it's important not to believe that research in isolation on its own. What's important is to take that research and combine it with other pieces of research, to combine it with clinical practice, to combine it with, anatomy and biomechanics and kinematics and all of the things that we would do in our CHEK assessments, so that we then have a much more functional, holistic understanding of why that hamstring strain may have come about in the first place, or whatever injury, it could be any part of the body. But so, essentially most of the research was saying that the leading cause of hamstring strain is hamstring strain. and that's still true. That's still true. If you look at it, in fact, I looked at the 3 most recent papers that came up on PubMed this morning, just so I thought, I'd better check to see what the status is of current research before I do this podcast. And it's still the same. It's still the most prevalent injury across all sports. The most common cause of hamstring strain is previous hamstring strain. So the interesting thing about that is you think, well, yeah, that kind of makes sense. You injure something, perhaps it's a bit weaker, etc. But muscles are extremely highly perfused with blood vessels, and so they should heal extremely well, very quickly. Minimal scar tissue, which is another thing that's cited as a cause of recurrent strain. And of course, that's not to say it's not a cause, but if it was the only cause, you'd expect any muscle that gets injured to keep getting re-injured, and that doesn't seem to be the case. I mean, of course, there's a trend towards that, but it's quite rare for people to get recurrent quad strains or recurrent calf strains, and it does happen, obviously, but it's not nearly as common as a recurrent hamstring strain. So seems to be something additional about the hamstrings that's driving this recurrent nature of it. And so to me, that's looking outside of it and looking at its function in that biomechanical chain.
When you were saying that, first of all, how ridiculous that is, right? It's a bit like saying the cause of death is dying.
Yes, it is.
And it happens often when it's happened before, right? Well, if
Yeah.
you believe in reincarnation, we've all died many times before. We're going to die again.
That's it. Yeah.
So what if our medical industry said, well, the reason that people die is because of death, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that would be even worse than what they're already doing. But
I mean, often the research would also talk about things like, the strength of the hamstrings being an issue. And in fact, even that wasn't well documented when I was doing the research in the 90s. It was some of the papers were saying, oh, maybe it's a strength thing, but it hadn't really been studied. A lot of them were saying that the hamstrings need stretching, which is, kind of controversial in some ways. Not that stretching hamstrings is controversial, it's just whether or not the person needs it is controversial, and whether or not that hamstring tension is there for another reason, which is something else we might talk about. But there's lots of reasons the hamstrings will tighten up, which are kind of functional, but they're compensations, and so this is stuff that really wasn't being talked about, and still from my research this morning, still they really aren't being talked about. So it's quite interesting that it takes a while for these ideas to kind of filter in, and we're still, I think, a little bit in the dark as to how to manage it all and prevent it.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I was a member of the UK Strength and Conditioning Association for quite a few years.
Yeah.
I think I only stopped my membership maybe a year or two ago. And pretty much the only thing that really I tended to get from any research or any articles was, hamstrings, you just got to do eccentric strengthening.
Yeah.
That was the thing. That was pretty much it.
Yeah. And that was, if I recall, that kind of came in the late noughties, like 2008, 2010, maybe, that kind of era, where someone had done a research study on Nordic curls, which is this thing where you're kneeling up high, and you kind of wedge your feet under something solid, and then you essentially, or you've got, your partner's holding your feet down, and the idea is you lower yourself down towards the ground, almost like to a press up position really, but you're using your hamstrings to control that eccentrically. And there's all kind of excitement about it and how this seemed to really help, and to be preventative and so on. And again, I think there's some merit to it, but it's still really ignoring how the hamstrings are used in functional daily movement, and in sporting movements. So it's still quite an isolated view. It's like, can we strengthen this muscle in an eccentric way in a sort of fairly non-functional movement pattern, but it seems to help. It's like a lot of things, you can strengthen a muscle, you could, let's say you could strengthen your low back muscles just by doing a bunch of deadlifts or something, and that may well help your back pain, but it's not going to switch on your multifidus, or it's not going to help you to move better in a more functional or efficient way necessarily. To do that, you really need to break those movement patterns down and build them back up into an integrated whole. And that's something that, of course, Paul CHEK was the first person to really talk about that, and to do it in a really effective way. And that was largely what attracted me into his training. It was a key part of what attracted me into the CHEK Institute training, was that he had this stuff down, and in a very holistic way, which makes perfect sense to my way of thinking and to the physiology and the applied biomechanics and so on. So yeah, that's what I would say about the eccentric.
Yeah, I mean,
curls.
In most instances, it's always going to be of benefit to strengthen a muscle, right?
Yes.
If you're putting it under a lot of load, there's going to be a benefit to making it a strong muscle.
Yeah, yeah.
So, but that's all well and good. But if, as you said, the hamstring is straining because it's compensating for something else that's probably weak, right, or something else that needs stabilizing, yeah, all well and good strengthening that muscle, but if you don't strengthen or balance what's around it, you're going to be constantly still putting excessive load through that muscle as well.
Yeah, and I think this is a big sort of flaw with the way we've been thinking about muscles for a long time, because muscles really, they're not just pieces of plasticine that you can either stretch or you can bunch up or whatever. They have a nervous system attached to them, and that nervous system is bidirectional. So it's both, your motor control centers in the brain that tell you how to move. They're sending information to the muscle about how to contract and when to contract and which portions of the muscle to contract and so on. But you've also got information coming back from the muscle to the brain to tell the brain what length the hamstring's in, what loads are coming up through the foot, what direction the body is about to turn, and so on. And all of that information is being integrated and synthesized to put out effective muscle contractions that allow you to run forwards or in sort of multiple planes of movement, or change direction, or turn, or kick a football, or jump to get a header and land slightly awkwardly. All of these things, the brain's monitoring all of that and putting out just an amazing sort of array of neural impulses to allow you to play a game of football or play a game of basketball or whatever it might be. So this idea that just doing some Nordic curls is the solution to hamstring strain is very basic, let's say.